Hi, everyone. Happy New Year, and thank you for joining us online for this evening's conversation with Meng Jin and Gish Jen. My name is Lily Philpott. I'm the Programs Manager at AAWW, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to our virtual event space. For those of you who are new to the Asian American Writers Workshop, we are a nonprofit organization dedicated to uplifting Asian diasporic literature and storytelling. You can visit aaww.org. You can follow us on Twitter, Instagram, or YouTube, where the recording of this event will be posted. During the event, we ask that all audience members practice nonviolence in the chat. Comments that are racist, transphobic, homophobic, ableist, and/or misogynist will be flagged, and the person will be removed from this event. We will have time for audience Q&A at the end of the night. You can ask questions via the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Books are for sale thanks to our friends at Books Are Magic. You can find a link to purchase in the chat, and you can support our authors and an independent bookstore in doing so. I am going to briefly introduce Meng and Gish, and then I hope you will join me in welcoming Meng on screen to read. Gish Jen is the author of 4 previous novels, a story collection, and 2 works of nonfiction. Her honors include the Lannan Literary Award for Fiction and the Mildred and Harold Strauss Living Award from the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. She delivered the William E. Massey Senior Lectures in American Studies at Harvard University. She teaches from time to time in China and otherwise lives in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Meng Jin was born in Shanghai and lives in San Francisco. A Kundiman Fellow, she is a graduate of Harvard and Hunter College. Little Gods is her first novel. Today, we are delighted to celebrate both Little Gods and the Resistors, both of which are out in paperback today. We hope you pick up these books, support our authors, and enjoy the evening. Please join me in welcoming Meng on screen to read.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Thank you, Lily, for that lovely introduction. And thank you to AAWW for inviting me and Gish to do this event. I couldn't think of a more wonderful way to celebrate the paperback launch of these books. I'm so honored to be here with Gish Jen, who many of you might know, was one of the first Chinese American authors that I read when I started thinking about becoming a writer. And yeah, it's just kind of mind-blowing that we get to be here tonight together. So I'm actually going to read from a photo essay about Shanghai that is published in the sort of end section of the paperback. And I thought about reading this because I took these photographs in 2016, in the summer of 2016, when actually I saw Gish in person for the first time. I don't know if we actually met, but Gish was in Shanghai doing an event with some local writers, and a friend of mine invited me. So here is the photo essay. All right, just gonna share my screen. All right, images of Shanghai, 2016. In the summer of 2016, by the generosity of the M Literary Residency, I spent 6 weeks in my birth city, Shanghai. I was there to finish my novel, Little Gods. I left Shanghai when I was a child. My memories of the city are the memories of a child, fleeting, fragmentary, flashes of sensory knowledge, closer to the knowledge of a dream than that of a photograph. Inside these memories were images so intense and vivid, I felt I could reach out and touch them. But when I did reach for them, they disintegrated immediately. I hope to stabilize my memory with images of the real city. Outside my window, the Shanghai of postcards was laid before me, sharp and glittering. This was a Shanghai that had been built after my departure, when the Pudong skyline was still mostly farmland. Time had changed me too, so we faced each other as strangers. Some days the city felt dense and impenetrable. Shanghai awed me with its seeming infinite layers of complexity. Each time you peeled one away, you found another just as layered and teeming. The innermost layer was the one I sought. Between the cracks of the buildings, crowding the feet of the skyline, longtangs weave through the body of the city like labyrinths. I knew I would never find the exact Shanghai I was looking for. In 2010, my childhood longtang had been demolished. On previous visits, I had searched for its remnants in vain. The closest I had gotten was confirmation of its non-existence. In a translated Sikumeng directory, I found the name of my neighborhood with a single asterisk beside it. According to the footnotes, a single asterisk meant has been obliterated. Still, I walk the streets where it should have been, searching for glimmers that, like Proust's bite of Madeleine dipped in tea, might bring my childhood home back to me in one unbroken piece. Some longtang remain. In these alleys, you can see the resourcefulness of the Shanghainese people through disruptions of empire, technology, and nature. The architecture wears bluntly its modeled colonial history. The narrow alleys are made narrower by frequent stacks of junk. Not a centimeter of space goes unused. And everywhere life is spilling out of the doors. Most of the time, however, the impossibility of my search was reflected back at me. Since 2005, the Shanghai municipal government has been modernizing the city through the methodical demolition of these old neighborhoods, many of which are admittedly deteriorating. Select areas have been preserved for historic value or rebuilt as tourist destinations, but most are marked with a Cai. Sometimes, instead of Cai, I found buildings marked as Kong, meaning they were empty. Kong, a paradox in a city that is continuously overfilling. I found myself compulsively photographing Cais wherever I saw them, which was all the time. I did not actively search. Impending obliteration is not photogenic or beautiful, but I continued to photograph with a vague imperative of duty to whom or what I didn't know. I still don't understand what good these images are for. They can't preserve anything. Not really. And besides, most of the residents would prefer to collect their relocation checks and go. They certainly can't bring back anybody's lost home. But there is something about looking at a site you know will soon disappear that compels you to keep looking. One fortuitous day, I unearthed a lost photograph of my longtang taken in 2008 during a last visit to the neighborhood before its demolition. I noticed an unusual looking building in the background. Using Baidu's Street View, I was able to locate the exact spot where my longtang would have been if it still stood. I went there. I saw that the unusual building still stood. What's being built here? I asked some construction workers. A shopping mall, they replied cheerfully. Now, when I imagine Shanghai, I long for no fixed image. Instead, I see a city racing to an unknown future at near light speed, in whose wake I can only blink. Thank you.
Hi, am I on screen now? First, let me say, Meng, that was just beautiful, and just hearing your voice, images, I can't even tell how much they meant. My family is also from Shanghai, and I have also spent a lot of time looking for remnants of the past. And it's so interesting that, even though my new book is very much concerned with the future, it's just listening to you and that Shanghai. I'm aware of how much even this book so sad so much of the loss. And so we'll be talking about that. But let me talk, just read just a few minutes from my book. My book, as many of you know, is called The Resistors. It is a post-automation surveillance state baseball feminist dystopia. So like I say, it sounds like it's very, very distant from what Meng is doing, but in a funny kind of way, it's related. And I'm going to read you two sections. One is just a little bit longer than the other, and then we'll talk. So this is from the beginning of the book. The book is narrated by the father in his family. In this family, his name is Grant, and he's talking about his daughter. He is a preternaturally gifted pitcher for a daughter. As her parents, Eleanor and I should have known earlier, but Gwen was a preemie to begin with. That meant oxygen at first, and after that, special checkups. And her early months were bumpy. She had jaundice, she had roseola, she had colic, she had a heart murmur. Things that I can now see distracted us, especially with the one chance policy. We were focused on her health to the exclusion of all else. For the netted, it was different, of course. But for us surplus, the limit was one pregnancy per couple, and Eleanor was just out of jail. Outside the house, she had a drone minder tracking her every move. The message was clear. She was not getting away with anything. And in any case, we loved Gwen and would never have wanted to replace her, worried though we were that she was delicate, that she might never consume the way she needed to, the way we all needed to. Not that charges of underconsumption couldn't be fought in the courts. This was auto America, after all. For all the changes wrought by AI and automation, now rolled up with the internet into the eye burrito we called Aunt Nettie, we did still have a constitution. And if anyone could defend what was left of our rights, it was our own Eleanor, of whom even the platoons of Canada geese who patrolled our neighborhood, the pit bulls, one might say, of the waddling world, were afraid. But as Eleanor's incarceration brought home, these battles had a price. And in the meanwhile, even worrying and weighing the options distracted us from realizing other things we might have noticed a bit earlier had Gwen had a sibling. It is so hard for a new parent to imagine a child any different from the one he or she has. Children do so have their own gravity. They are their own normal. And so it is only now we can see that there are signs. All children take what's in their crib and throw it, for example. It's universal. But Gwen threw her stuffed animals straight through her bedroom doorway. They shot out, never so much as grazing the doorframe, and they always hit the wall of the staircase across from her bedroom at a certain spot, with the precise force they needed to bounce forward and drop clean down to the bottom of the stairwell. Was she maybe 2 when she did this? Not even, although she was already a southpaw. And already she seemed to have unusually long arms and long fingers, or so I remember remarking one day. Not that Eleanor and I had so many babies on which to base our comparison. Ours was just an impression, but it was a strong impression. Her fingers were long. I remember too having to round up a veritable menagerie on the landing before I could start up the stairs. The stuffed hippo, the stuffed tiger, the 3 or 4 stuffed dogs, the stuffed orca and platypus and turtle. I gathered them all into my arms like the storybook zookeeper of some peaceable kingdom. It was as if I too ought by rights to have been made of plush. Of course, our house was automated, as all surplus houses were required to be by law, and the animals could easily have been clear floated. All I had to do was say the word and the house spots would emerge from their closets, their green appendages poised to help. Clear float now? Aren't those animals in your way? And we can roll and clear if you prefer. You have a choice. You always have a choice. The choice business being a new feature of the program, a bit of cyber ingratiation, you might say, to balance its more habitual cyber intimidation. If you trip, it will be your own fault, for example, and do note that your choice is on the record. Nothing is being hidden from you. Your choice is on the record. Meaning that I was losing living points every time. Living points being something like what we used to call brownie points when I was growing up, except that these were more critical than money for everything from getting a loan to getting a plan to getting Gwen into net you one day, should we dream of doing that. A goal that people said involved tens of thousands or maybe even hundreds of thousands of points. But I picked the animals up myself anyway, as did Eleanor when it was she who came upon them, her silver hair and black eyes shining, and all because we wanted to dump the animals into Gwen's crib ourselves and hear her quick christening laughter as she immediately set about hurling them again. Everything was a game to her, a most wonderful, loving, endless game. Her spy eyes lit up with mischief, her tea brown cheeks flushed the hot orange pink you see on the underside of clouds at sunset. Often she laughed so hard she fell as she threw, plopping down on her soft bottom, but grabbing the crib rails so hard as she scrambled back up that the whole crib shook. Was this the delicate newborn we had once so anxiously tended? Now breathtakingly robust, indestructible it seemed, she wore an old-time soft yellow blanket sleeper with attached feet and bunny ears, a hand-knit, extra-warm version of a suit Eleanor remembered from her own childhood. None of this baby zone heating over Gwen's crib, in other words. She hardly seemed to need zone heat in any case, having learned so early to blow on her hands if they were cold and to cuddle with us as she needed for warmth. Indeed, we were all cuddling, and we all wore sweaters too to avoid turning on the zone heat, for which we were constantly house scolded. Don't you find it a bit chilly? Why not choose to turn on the zone heat? You'll be more comfortable, Eleanor especially. Don't you find it a bit chilly? But we ignored. For this was how the auto house started, wasn't it? With thermostats that sent to Aunt Nettie first data, then videos. Then came drone deliverers and fridge stockers, kid trackers and robo-sitters, elder helpers and yard bots, all of which reported to Aunt Nettie as dutifully as any spy network, recording our steps, our pictures, our relationships, and back when we soon-to-be surplus still had them, our careers. And she, in turn, took what she knew and applied it, even proffering along the way solace and advice. Indeed, in the early days of automation, I myself brought up Ask Aunt Nettie more often than and can still remember her consoling voice as she volunteered, I'm here, and insisted, I want to hear everything, and reassured me, of course you feel that way, Grant. How could you not? You're only human. I did laugh at that, you're only human. And now I'm just going to read a very short section from later on in the book. Gwen has gone on, and now she and her teammates are getting ready to play in the Olympics against the China team. And they're looking at the China Russia team. The China Russia team is terrifying. I see. The China Russia team is terrifying, in partly because they've all been bioengineered. So that means that they're all switch hitters. Perhaps all this was fear, pure and simple, on the part of Gwen's teammates. But feeding their obsession, of course, was the sense that baseball was more than a sport, that it was a crown jewel. There were people who said it wasn't even invented in America. There were people who pointed out it was mentioned by Jane Austen long before it was ever mentioned here. But if baseball took on a hallowed meaning, it took on that meaning in our American dreams. For was this not the level playing field we envisioned, the field on which people could show what they were made of? And didn't we Americans believe above all that everyone should have a real chance at bat? Didn't we believe that with the good of the team at heart, something in us might just hit a ball off our shoe tops and sailing clear? If Gwen's teammates were playing China Russia for something, I thought, it was for this. For a chance to show, my mother would have said, that even if we all returned to the dirt and the wind and the rain, like the plants and the animals, we had a bigness in us, something beyond algorithms and beyond upgrades, something we were proud to call human, or so it seemed to me. Thank you. Did I say thank you loud enough? Oh, you just meant, Meng, great. So Meng, it's really a great, great, great pleasure to share a little event with you. I was a big fan of yours. You could probably tell by my review, and it really is. It's a stunning debut, and I'm hoping that a year later that just the joy of it is still with you. How does it feel now that I've not only done the hardcover but the paperback? It's quite a moment for you. I mean, are you still aglow?
Well, it's been quite a year in between, so it's been, yeah, I think I've got a little bit of distance and perspective this year, because of how nuts the world has been. I was reflecting on when the hardcover came out in January of last year, and the president was getting impeached. And it was it was apparent because like one of my interviews was canceled. One of my radio interviews was canceled because they were covering impeachment all day. And I was like, oh, great. And now here we go again. It's almost like no time has passed and all the time in the world.
Yeah, I've also had books come out during elections, and I've had friends come out, publish books on 9/11.
Yeah.
What you will soon discover is that something is almost always happening during one's pub, and in a funny kind of way, your pub matters so much to you, but the rest of the world barely notices. But I sort of wanted to, since this is the writers' workshop and people are so interested in process, and I think we should talk about our books, but I think we should also maybe you could talk a little bit about your journey. I think that there are a lot of people in the audience who would basically like to be you, right? So they're working on their first book, and they're working on their first book, and they have roots maybe in Asia as you and I do. I mean, not everybody's from
Yeah.
Shanghai, of course, but they've all made a similar actually, as they're making two journeys. Often they're making one journey which is just from like, wow, I have a blank page to like, wow, how do these books get written? That is really long. We're just sitting at the beginning. It's just like, really? And people go on to write like 7 books. It seems so improbable. So that's one journey, which is just from I barely know what point of view is to finished book. And of course, for people like you and me, we have another journey, because we do have roots in another culture, where the whole narrative thing, the whole novel tradition is just not native. And we frequently also, well, there are probably 3 journeys. It's also the journey often we have parents, who often do not get this thing at all. So who really see this whole enterprise as way more individualistic than anything that they ever dreamed would come would happen to them and their family. And so there's kind of 3 things going on. And I wonder if you want to talk a little bit about that, because like I say, I think that obviously your journey was my journey at one point. And
Yeah.
I think, interestingly, even I don't know how many years out, I guess my first book came out in 1991. So I've been at this for quite a while. That means that I sat down to write Typical American in 1986, a time when the words Asian American novel did not really exist.
Yeah.
Did not exist. I can still remember my agents were saying like about my book. She said it's about people coming to America. It's about like the term immigrant novel did not like leap to mind, and of course I wrote that book at a time when people did not believe that Asian Americans could write novels. Do you know what I mean? I mean, as you
Right.
probably know, Maxine Hong Kingston had meant Woman Warrior to be a novel and been forced to publish it as a memoir because Asian Americans did not write novels. Even when I was writing my first book, I wrote it at the Bunting Institute at Radcliffe. And I was asked almost every day, I said, aren't you really writing immigrant autobiography? And, so, well, I mean, this is by educated people. I got asked every day. And every single
Yeah.
day I had to say, actually, yeah, no, actually, I'm writing a novel. And actually, I'm producing, not artifact, but artifice. So, that was another big struggle. Anyway, all these things today, happily, people presumably don't say those things to you anymore. Now, today, presumably, people can accept that you're writing a novel. But I wonder if you want to talk a little bit about, kind of what, what it's like to enter this tradition, or what it was like for you, just getting up the nerve to tell your parents that you're going to be a novelist, where you got this idea. I mean, because we both went to Harvard, am I right?
I guess so, yes.
Oh God.
Yeah.
So,
And I was actually terrified of the English department at Harvard. It was in the most intimidating building, with like all these deer heads on the wall. um, I don't know if you remember that.
yeah, of course.
Um, and I took like 2 English classes, like that were in the requirements, and I studied basically everything else. I studied social studies, and I did pre-med, as because I told my parents I have my plan B, don't worry, I can always go back on my pre-med requirements. um,
You will
yeah, I think.
you will not be surprised to hear that I was also pre-med and pre-law.
What did
And I
and pre-law.
actually dropped out of Stanford Business School. So this is, I think, and this is very familiar too. I mean, I wrote
Yeah.
this part of the story. I was once at a did an event not too long ago, and 3 of us from Harvard, 70, what were we all about 77, 78 or so. And we sort of, the 3 of us stood there, and it was like a trifecta. I had dropped out of business school. Another one had dropped out of law school. And the other one had dropped out of med school. And there we were. But anyway, so this is a very familiar part of the story. But please say about
Yeah.
what did it mean at the time that you were doing it? We're like the old.
Yeah. No, I think it honestly, what everything that you've said sounds familiar to me. I remember because I didn't really have a big humanities education or background. I wasn't really encouraged to read when I was a kid. I remember when I decided after college, I was like, I'm really going to try to do this, and went about it quite methodically, making reading lists for myself, and especially like Asian American reading lists. And yeah, I remember, discovering your work in the Best American Short Stories of the century, um, and reading it and just being like, oh my God, this is like not just like we are Chinese people drinking tea and and or like we have such tender immigrant feelings. It's funny, it's ambitious, it looks outside of just the Chinese American experience, or the experience of immigration. And that you were really one of the writers that made me feel like, okay, like I don't necessarily have to, produce the kind of work that people are expecting me to produce. And I think it's if I teach a little bit now, and it feels like my students are not going through as much, just as I'm not going through as much of the, oh, you must be writing your own story, right? It surely you can only be expressing yourself, not creating art, or surely you must be like creating testimony, and not a work of art. But I feel, yeah, when I started writing, I felt like I did get a lot of feedback that, it took me a long time in my writing workshops to get over the fact that all of my professors and most of my peers were white, and that the parts of my writing that they liked were like the more exotic, um, Chinesey parts. I literally had a teacher, this was before the MFA, I literally had a teacher who gave me feedback that was like, oh, like do more of the Chinese stuff. And it took me a while to understand how to sort of push back against that, and to ignore it, and to come to my own sense of what I wanted my writing to be. Because I think, especially as someone who doesn't come from a literary background, you're like, please, I need, tell me what's good. And a lot of writing this book was learning to ignore what other people thought, um, and learning to really listen to, what it was inside me that wanted to create and wanted to write.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Of course, I also have the letter from the Paris Review that literally the rejection letter said we prefer more exotic work. You
Oh, wow.
I mean, just it's right out there. Today, they maybe might hesitate to sort of say that. Um, but I think that this what you're describing, and I'm sure many people in the audience can also relate. I mean, I think that they can see that there's a kind of saleable commodity that everybody
Right,
sees in you, and you have
right.
to really resist. And for me too, a lot of that meant that I defined myself very early as an American writer,
Mm,
because and everybody wanted to be right about China. Now, as it happens, I have actually been in times, and but I didn't want to, I didn't some kind of ambassador. Do you know what I mean? I
right.
think there are a couple of different roles for you. One is being exotic. Nothing is being an ambassador of some sort, and another, of course, as things got more political, is really being a professional victim. And
Right.
I also, I just thought, I don't want to be a professional victim. I actually want to be a writer,
Yeah.
and that was, there's, it's a kind of this minefield, when you're negotiating. But the very happy, the very happy situation with you is that you made it through. And I think that maybe one of the things that people might be interested to hear sounds like, look, you could hear, I also heard myself in the end, I ignored all these things, just like you. I mean, I literally had a little ritual in um, that I would enact before I started working, where I would make like a little icon of various people who had various opinions, and in my mind, a little icon, and I would literally pick it up and put it in the trash, or out in the hall. And but I would basically, but there were a lot of these speakers, and they weren't all and in other words, some people who had opinions were not bad people. But so I removed the people with good opinions though too. Do you know John Updike, who had such a good opinion of me? And no sooner did I realize what a good opinion he had of me than I had to put him out in the hall, because it was a happy thing. But I'm not here to write for John Updike. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
Here to write for myself. And as you know, if you're from an Asian background, this business of writing for yourself is that's a very radical act,
Yeah.
and it doesn't come naturally to us, for many reasons that we can discuss. And of course, as you know, I've written a lot about that, but it doesn't come naturally to us.
Yeah.
And so it's a fight the whole way. But I'm sort of interested. So we hear that I've had this little ritual, and I'm wondering whether you
Mm.
had anything like that you would be able to to share with the audience, that would also, how did you find your way? Because this book that you've written is very striking. It's very unlike any other Asian American novel. It doesn't feel like, oh, she's been reading a lot of Maxine Hong Kingston. Not that we don't love Maxine Hong Kingston. The first time I met her, she said, just because I had said something about, Harold Bloom has this anxiety of influence thing. And so I had sort of said, I had to kind of ignore, Maxine Hong Kingston. And he has this thing where you kill the writers ahead of you. And she said, I heard that you wanted to kill me. Maxine is so sweet. I'm like, no, 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 Maxine. I didn't mean I wanted to hurt you. But at some level, what I really was saying, what really was that I had to put her out in the hall. The same, I'm sure you had to put me out in the hall. You have to put everybody out in the hall. But I
Yeah.
wonder if you had, I wonder how you did that, like whether you had rituals that you used, and how you cleared the space for yourself so that you could hear yourself, so that you could write this really very singular book that is at one way and
Yeah.
on one level very identifiably Asian American, um, and in another way completely unlike any other Asian American or any other American novel. So like, where did you find that? Like, how did you do that?
Yeah. I love what you said earlier. I loved hearing about you talking about how you identified yourself as an American writer. I think I had a similar sort of similar sorts of things that I would insist upon. One thing was always that if anyone ever said that I was writing about identity, I
Mm.
would correct them and say I'm writing about the self. um, um, because I felt that identity was something superficial that society imposed upon you, and it's the self's way of responding to others' view of us, and that I think I wanted from the start when I started writing, I knew that I wanted to be able to write with this the sort of freedom that I saw white guys writing with, where I wasn't sort of bound to write about anything basically, except for the things I wanted to write about. And I didn't. I love your ritual. I wish I had something as cute to share, but I think mostly I at a certain point, my work, I think, started really growing and becoming itself when I realized that I hadn't read a book like the one I wanted to write, and that that was a good thing, and and that that I should be writing the book I wanted to read. So in my head, sort of I think there was a point in which I like shifted my imaginary audience, from the whatever you imagine American readers or the general readership to be, and I shifted that and I started writing for myself when I was younger, basically. I started writing for the person who was reading and trying to find the book that I craved to read, um, and then realizing that that book didn't exist yet and that I had to write it. So I think that was one of the sort of mantras that I had. The that you're writing the book that you want to read, that a version of yourself who basically has had the same experiences and has the same is interested in the same things, is delighted by the same things, is moved by the same things, but hasn't had the exact same ideas that you have had. um, yeah, and that really changed. I think that really helped me and changed my work because I was no longer explaining myself as much as I was in my earlier work.
Yeah, it's interesting. So, another thing, I don't know if this will resonate with you, but, of course, there's also books that sort of, we talk about the freedom of the, white male writer, there are books that are still in territory that's not ours, right? So, I mean, in this, and that's only because we're Asian American, but also because we're women, you know.
Yeah.
So this business, first of all, my first book, as you know, is called Typical American, and of course, I did get a lot of
Right.
pushback on like how can these people be typical American? How
Mm,
can you be claiming basically the great American novel?
right.
How can you be doing that? And even now, so many books in, there's still territory which is not okay. In this case, the baseball novel. It is coincidentally, I'm not the only woman to have claimed this territory in this round. It just coincidentally, Emily Neiman's, the Bears Review, did it at the same time. She did, but it's interesting. Well, what you can sort of see too is like a journey that I've been on. You will, whatever, what generations, a half generation later, you'll go on the same journey, and the people will feel the same, in the same box, and you'll suddenly realize, oh wow, you know what I mean? Like, why can't women write about baseball? Excuse me. And with baseball being extremely important because it is the American sport. So when women can't write about baseball, you are saying that there's a whole portion of America that is fenced off in some way, which is not yours. Um, so it was kind of interesting that Emily Neiman's also felt this, this kind of restriction, and also chose to write against it, and also did it, as I did, with the sense that we were boy territory, and we knew that, it was interesting. We both had the sense that you cannot get one detail wrong because they're,
Mm,
you know what I mean? It's dangerous. And I mean, in other sense that, you understand that the audience is looking, they're looking to find fault. and
Yeah.
they're looking to question your authority. And it's, and I don't, and this is a question for you, so I don't know if there is a point at which you realize that you had kind of, there was something there's something out there that's waiting to get you, in the point where you realize, like, oh, they didn't get me. Because, like, I know for me, it was kind of like when I passed muster with any number of major baseball biographers, and, when I passed muster with Bill Nolan and Jane Levy, all these people have written biographies of, Mickey Mantle and you name it. And also with baseball fans, I mean, I put my book through, the biggest baseball fans I could find.
Wow.
And I know the moment when and I passed, it almost didn't matter what the reviews said. I knew that I had gotten in there, and I actually don't really know that much about baseball, but I
Wow.
knew that, I learned a lot. Obviously, I did a lot of studying, did a lot of research, and but nobody said to me, like, that's not how pitchers feel, or that's not how pitchers. Do you know what I mean? That's not how they act, or
Yeah.
that's not that's how the game goes, or any of those, any of those things. Nobody said any of that. Everybody said, like, oh, you must really, you must be you must be a pitcher.
Well,
Actually, I'm not a pitcher.
That was
I can't even throw.
Yeah,
I can't throw a ball from, like, here across the room.
Neither can I. But I mean, I found all the baseball in here so delightful. I learned so much about it. And I was curious if I thought that surely you must have a deep love for baseball, and that's why you wanted to write a baseball novel. But was there another reason?
Well, I do have a familiar, funny, oddly, I don't play baseball myself. And I don't know it in my, like, neither of my children, everyone's like, is it Gwen your daughter? Neither of my children can catch or hit or any of those things, and they don't throw, they read philosophy, what I'm saying? They don't do any of those things. But it is true that my mother was an avid Yankees fan. And, as many immigrants are, I mean, in the sense that, when she first came to America from Shanghai, that was this is one of the first ways that she kind of performed being American, and learned, I will say, a lot about what America was. This whole idea of the level playing field, as being from Shanghai, that's not an idea that you grow up on. And she went on to be, such an avid fan that she did die of COVID this spring. I know.
I'm so sorry.
And we did bury her with a Yankees cap. I mean, she was really a fan, and my brother could really pitch. Now, I have to say that most of my siblings don't, but my brother could really throw, and he was something that he would not have discovered he could do. Had he not come to America and been a little bit wild, and my father somehow found a boys club for him, and turned out he had quite a little childhood formed by baseball. So, so I had some familiarity with it, but truly I hadn't really, it was more that there was something I wanted to write about what I thought was happening to America. And, as I was trying to think about how to dramatize what we could be losing. And as you can see, which we appear to be losing, and it's sort of the danger to democracy. And I was looking for a way of conveying that dramatically. And I said, of course, baseball.
Yeah.
So I come to it, like I have a kind of emotional, feeling about it, but truly I hadn't thought about baseball in many, many years. And my family, they're all crazy. All are Yankees fans, which, I'm from Boston. I'm like, we are definitely not Yankees fans, but we are. And so I don't have the patience to, like, watch all those games, and, they're watching that every pitch, and you know what I mean? And I don't have the patience for any of that. So it really was.
Yeah, but you could really.
But
yeah, you could really feel the tenderness.
Baseball now.
What?
I'm more interested in baseball now than I was when I started my book. Now that I know a little bit about it, now it's really interesting. I could probably write.
Yeah. You could really feel the tenderness in the way that you wrote about it. And I was especially drawn to how you described the relationship between the catcher and the pitcher, which I had no idea because I have not watched baseball. I'm not really a baseball fan. And how you use that in this brilliant character dynamic between two best friends. Um, yeah, it was one of those things that made me think that you must know the sport deeply. And it also made me realize that Andi was, as like exciting a character as Gwen.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's a little bit like the relationship between that Ju-won and Sulan. Ju-won, when she sort of said that, she's
Mm,
like this, like this, the person that they're kind of related because each one is
right.
the person that one hoped that she could be, and the other is the person that she fears she could be. And so you also and we probably could go on. I warned you, Lily, that we had a lot to talk about. And that we could go on very easily, but we haven't even scratched the surface here. But nonetheless, I can see that you're here, and it's time to take questions from the audience. But
Yeah,
I think the fact that we have that, I think that honestly, for somebody out there who's looking for a little paper to write, there's a paper there.
Another thing that I noticed while I was reading your book that felt like a sort of symbiotic relationship was that it's narrated from the perspective of a parent about the child. And I realized while I was reading that I can't think of another book that's told from that point of view. And it was like at points that that point of view is like just unbearable for me to read, like unbearably heartbreaking. um yeah, because I think a lot of times, like my book obviously has a child looking at a parent, and that's the more typical sort of gaze, the especially when we're thinking about immigrant stories, the child looking backwards, looking at the past, and I guess it makes sense that your dystopian novel is looking into the future. And I really felt that sense of like of of the weight a parent must feel with a child, growing up in um, a horrible world and wanting that child to have a bright future and wanting them to have freedom and wanting to protect them. So.
Well, you got it, and I see that Lily is here, and I think that she's here to tell us to take questions. But I will say that you are, your first book, obviously many things to pioneer, and and very exciting, and many new things to write. And I will say that of course, just the same way you write against certain preoccupations, I write against the older writer. And I think there is some sense that well, you must be done because you wrote the story about being young and growing up already. But as you can sort of see, actually there are many other stories to be written, and I feel so privileged to be an older writer who still has a few things to say. And a point of view that's different. Do you know what I mean? In other words, a point of view on the same experience that is where it's so familiar, but yet funny, oddly enough, from where I sit, it looks very different. So anyway, but Lily, I think it's time. I warned you we would have a lot to say.
I know. I feel like we could go on forever, and I'm so grateful. I know there is love in the chat as well, but I'm so grateful for this conversation. It's really been just so vibrant, and I'm so glad to hear both of you speak. I think we have time for just a few audience questions, which I will read. If you have any questions, you can put them in the Q&A box on Zoom, and we will do our best to get to them. So the first is from Rachel Marks, who asks, she writes, Shanghai is such an ever-changing city. In what ways does it still feel like home?
It's funny, but I think at one point in your book, you sort of say it's just also Chinese. It's hard to say, but it's oddly enough, even though unlike Meng, I was born in America, so I only knew Shanghai through my mother, and yet as soon as I got there, it really did feel like home. I mean, so many of the things that people are preoccupied with, the way that they think, And and I could really sense the difference even between Shanghai and Beijing. Where Shanghai
Yeah.
is just much more familiar. And but Meng, you have much more to say about than I think. But there's a whole Shanghai way of thinking,
Yeah,
and and
there definitely is. I mean,
including what they think of other Chinese.
yes. Well, and
Please.
my family isn't old school Shanghainese, where my parents are migrated to Shanghai from the provinces. So so Shanghainese-ness is not in our blood, but maybe that means I can see it a little more. I've definitely been on the hard edge of that Shanghainese-ness before, on the receiving end. I haven't been back since. I haven't been back in a really long time. So, but I do think that there's just whenever I go back to Shanghai or to any part of China that my family lives in, there's just it just opens up a part of me that perhaps lives in my memory, and doesn't really ex- exhibit itself in American context, and it makes me remember the cadences of language, the smells, all everything that's coming in from the environment of a place that's just sort of irreplaceable. Just yeah, it reminds me of a part of something that has made me, and I think that's so much why I write too, is just to capture those those intangible, and sort of inexpressible feelings that I always feel like I'm on the verge of losing, because a place is changing so quickly, or because I'm changing, or because I'm running away from it or going to a new place.
But Shanghai, oh, it remains Shanghai. I will say that just as one small anecdote of when I realized, oh, I recognize this, and when back in the days, in the very early days of development, many places in China, if they took your credit card, or they'd just gotten credit cards, and they always handed your credit card back with two hands. You know, Shanghai was the first place where it's, here's your card. I mean, I mean, they hadn't been developed for 5 minutes before the Shanghai
Yeah.
attitude was back, and it's basically we're Shanghai, you know. You
I
know what I
also
mean?
love they always
I mean, it's like,
like when
hey,
you're
we're Shanghai, you know.
that's true.
And
I also love
and by the
just
way,
like
and they're not going to bow to you because you're an American. Excuse me.
right. And just like the unapologetic way they look and appraise. They're like, don't worry, I'm looking at your entire outfit and I see you and I have judged you.
And what is the matter with Americans? Why do you dress like that? I mean, they can't believe how we dress. I mean, if you've ever shown up in Birkenstocks in a Shanghai hotel, you will know how fallen we are from a fashion point of view.
Thank you both. So I have just a couple more questions. My next one comes from Cora Stryker. I hope I'm pronouncing your names correctly. And it is, which books do you consider the grandparents of your books? In other words, what are the 2 or 3 books without which your books would not exist?
Do you want to go first?
Well, that's such a hard question because for me, it's not 2 or 3 books, but let me, I sort of say that we think that, and we didn't know about the inn that does not have a strong narrative tradition, that I'm sure that I would not have been able to master the novel without Shakespeare. You know what I mean? So King Lear, 5 acts, all that stuff was absolutely foundational. And then I think that, Meng was talking about this kind of freedom to kind of say whatever it is that you're going to say. And I have to say that, I think that I was very, very influenced by the Jewish writers. And I will say, and that would include, all of them, but especially maybe Grace Paley, who I think also kind of, in terms of work that was both actually art, but actually engaged. She was, for me, she was the model, like you could actually write stuff that was about society, very engaged,
Mhm.
And yet, it ain't journalism. So that's leaving out 100,000 books. But anyway, well,
I love that. I could totally. I wanted to, if we had more time, I'd ask you about humor, your humor, and that sort of answers it a little bit. I love that. I love Grace Paley too. For Little Gods in particular, I'd say there are, I think, three-ish books that really come to mind that very directly um, helped me. One of them was the Elena Ferrante's Neapolitan novels. So I was very thrilled when you mentioned her in your review. Thank you, Gish. um, Elena Ferrante's, yeah, just the way that she writes about social mobility and the, I think really there's not another writer who can see the nuances of people who leave um, with more, yeah, with more acuity than Elena Ferrante, and um, and there's a book called In the Light of What We Know by Zia Haider Rahman, which is which is sort of modeled off of Austerlitz. And it's about a mathematician. And reading that book gave me sort of permission to one, write in long paragraphs, and two, write about science in a way that it gave me a model of how to write about science in a way that felt beautiful, not just sort of like Bill Nye the Science Guy, science, you know. um, and the last book that really influenced me, this book in particular, was Chang Rei Li's Adjust Your Life. The narrator in that book has such a circular way of thinking that and such a sort of deflective way of thinking that I really used when I was writing Yongzhong's section in this book.
Thank you. I love these book recommendations. I think we have time for just one more, unfortunately. There are so many good questions, but we do need to wrap up in a moment. But one last question from M. Nardone, who writes, I would love to hear about what you are both working on next. And Meng, does write the book you want to read still hold for your second book? And does what you want to read change as you grow as a writer and a reader?
Okay, sure. Since there's a direct question for me there, I'll go first. Yeah, I think so. Yes, and yes. Definitely what I want to read changes as I grow as a writer and a reader. I feel like I got a lot out of my system with Little Gods. I also feel like I put a lot into Little Gods because I was, sort of what we were talking about earlier, Gish, like there wasn't the expectation that I would be able to do it again. I sort of felt like it was my one shot. And now I feel like it has, because I've gotten this out of my system, I feel like I can play, I can have more fun. I'm really interested in playing now more with style and with humor and with provocation. um, with stuff that with writing that is a little more out there stylistically, and yeah. So the next I'm working on a novel called Mothers and Girls, which I'm calling a fake memoir, um, sort of as a tongue-in-cheek nod to our dear Maxine and her fake memoir. And it's a book that is about building mythologies and tearing them down.
sounds wonderful. I can't wait. I'm actually I just placed a new book with Knopf, so it'll be out next year. just about this time next February. So I haven't talked about it very much, but since I guess now that it's an editorial, I can talk about it. It is a collection of linked stories. So this, as you can sort of see, I'm out having a great time. It's kind of a little bit of a return. So this is a story, it's linked as a collection of linked stories through which you can sort of see the 50 years since the opening of China refracted through the various stories and the various characters. And it is called Thank You, Mr. Nixon. So next year, next February, very irreverent look, as you can imagine.
That's so exciting. Well, I hope we can celebrate both of these books, but Gish, I hope we can celebrate that book in person next year. I just want to thank you both so much for taking the time to join us this evening. I want to thank everyone in the audience and call for a virtual round of applause in the Zoom chat, as again, we can't be in person, of course. I have just a couple of very quick closing notes, primarily that tomorrow evening at 8 p.m. Eastern, we are going to stream a talkback conversation with Meng Jin Lee and Lee Isaac Chung, who is the writer-director of the forthcoming film Minari. And that will be on our YouTube page. It is, we recorded it this weekend and it's an incredible conversation. So I hope you can tune in. I want to thank our friends at Books Are Magic again, amazing local indie bookstore in New York City, who are our virtual booksellers for all of these online events. There's a link to purchase Meng and Gish's books in the chat, and we hope that you do and support them both. And then just finally, this event was recorded. It will be on our YouTube page and it will be on our podcast, AAWW Radio. So you can return to it, listen again, and please do share. So yeah, thank you both so much. This was such a huge pleasure. This is actually the first event of 2021 for us. So thank you both. We could not have had a better pair of authors to start with. Well, thank you.
Great fun. It's a great way to meet Meng. May this not be the last.
So such an honor. Hopefully in person one day.
We'll have to do it again. We always just